Now it's time to talk about risk factors, and we're going to talk about modifiable risk factors. Michael, what do we mean by modifiable?
Well, basically, risk factors that put your brain at risk, but that we have some control over. We can actually change our relationship to the risk. We can change the risk itself. And by doing that, we can limit or moderate the risk that we are at of getting some kind of disease.
Okay. What type of risks are we going to be talking about?
Okay. One of the things we talked about in another segment is that with chronic diseases and Alzheimer's and dementia in particular, it's not one single factor that seems to cause the disease. It's multiple factors.
What we call combinations, combinatorial.
Combinatorial, yeah, it's a multifactorial. So there are these variety of modifiable risk factors that contribute. There's a new report out by the Alzheimer's Disease International, and they do an interesting job of categorizing the types of risk factors that lead to dementia and Alzheimer's. They talk about developmental factors, and to a certain extent that's talking about development in terms of there are different stages in your life when certain risk factors are greater and than they are at other periods.
And so by being educated as to what's coming up in your next phase of life, you're more aware of the risk factors.
Yeah, and one of the things with risk factors, we talk about risk factors and protective factors, and they almost in many cases are the flip side of each other. You know, so if you say lack of education,
so what's the flip side of that?
Education.
Education.
More education you have, the more protected.
And when they say education, we're not talking about a formal degree or a certain, but it's gaining knowledge and using your brain to put that puzzle of whatever your challenging field is.
Right. So that they would put more developmentally early in your life, because the more years you have of stimulating your brain, you know, the greater the protection. It still functions even if when you're old. Lifelong learning is terrific, and you will get benefits from it, but it's much better if you could do that, sort of, you know, accumulate that across the lifetime. They also talk about psychological and psychosocial factors. So depression, for example, is correlated with increased dementia.
So if someone is afraid that a loved one or themselves has some sort of depression issue, they might want to start thinking of taking care of that immediately, a modifiable factor, because if you let it go, then that is correlated to a higher risk of dementia later on?
Right. That's the key point on all of what we're doing, is that these are things you need to be aware of, and the more you're aware of, the more you're empowered to actually try to do something. Minimize the risk, maximize the protective value. Lifestyle factors is a third category that and that's something that we deal with a lot, is what are the lifestyle choices that we make and what are the behaviors that we engage in and how do you change those. Cardiovascular risk is the fourth area, and that's something we talk about a lot, and you hear neuroscientists say all the time when they're talking about brain health, what's good for your heart is good for your brain.
That's right. And when we first heard that years ago, it made so much sense, because the blood flow that you're trying to get your heart in good shape, that's key to getting the nutrition and the flow of fuel to your brain. You choke that off with a weak cardiovascular system, and certainly the engine's going to sputter because you're not getting that fuel pumped. Take care of the pump and take care of the piping, pretty soon you've got that flow back.
Now, an interesting thing that seems to happen with these multifactorial combinatorial risk factors is that they seem to work like a cascade, where the little one
cascade. Go ahead.
Think of it in terms of a dam, for example. You've got a dam reservoir. Your brain is almost like a reservoir of information and stuff. You're piling it in. You're building it up. Little risk factors might create a leak in the dam. Just one little tiny leak, and you think, you know, that's not a big deal. But if you don't correct it, you know, that leak gets a little bit bigger. And if another one...
You might not even notice the leak unless you were inspecting it, unless you were aware that now's the time in your life you need to be making sure the dam is
Yeah, or
okay.
you're, I mean, you can't often go into the brain and recognize what's being done, but you can look at your behaviors or psychosocial
Okay.
stuff and say, oh, you know, I shouldn't be smoking. Maybe that's something that I should be dealing with. What starts out as just one, maybe two, the little one starts getting bigger, and this cascade, one type of risk factor will tend to set off another type of risk factor. So I want to read through this so I'm making sure that, because it's a long list of risk factors, and the point of this is not for you to learn the risk factors. It's more to just get the idea that
Right.
there are multiple ones. Oh, now I've messed it up. But the idea is some of the risk factors that we start with, like sedentary lifestyle or obesity or illiteracy, that we talked about, that can be amplified or moderated by things like your socioeconomic status. If you're poor, if you're born unlucky to be born poor, that's a risk factor in and of itself, because you don't have access to the resources that you need, you don't have the food that you need. So those two things begin to amplify each other. If you go on and if you're subject to pollution and to toxins in the water and to chemicals that are getting into you because of the foods and so on, each of those magnifies the impact.
So they're cumulative, but they're also, they amplify and make the challenge and the risks higher. But can something be done later in life to then reverse that trend?
Yeah, you can begin to go up, but let me go through this sort of
Yeah, yeah.
cascade thing first. What that leads then to are real conditions in the body, like chronic inflammation or a chronic immune response. And those are systemic things that start happening in your body that you're not even aware of necessarily, but it puts this added burden on your body. And then that moves into, that can lead to actual diseases that we recognize, like diabetes, hypertension.
They were triggered by this cascade so that your immune system might have been lowered, so you're more susceptible. And then when it manifests itself to symptoms, you take care of that one. But the root still is going to be the environmental or the modifiable risk factors. So it's the modification that we're trying to get to, educate how to modify.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, in some of these diseases, there are actual medications that you can take, but you also want to look at what in the environment was making it worse, you know, for you, because so you need to get at both of those. And then finally, as you're going along, these diseases will contribute to ultimate cognitive decline and dementia and Alzheimer's. So it's this buildup of risk factors.
Okay.
So as you're suggesting, yeah, you want to work your way back, you know, almost and identify, well, what is putting my brain at risk?
Right.
You know, and through education, through what we're doing, through what a lot of people are doing in terms of identifying these risk factors, say, okay, this is putting me at risk. What can I do to modify it? How can I actually change this? Some of the things are easier to change than others, obviously. We have more control over our own behavior than we do about what's in the environment, but we should be lobbying, you know, for clean air.
Doing what we can.
Yeah, doing what
But through education, you're at least aware of the risk, and then the tools that are being developed to be able to identify the risk first and then take some action empowers someone to at least to try to do something for themselves, for their loved ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a movement in the Alzheimer's field it's a recognition that Alzheimer's probably starts a lot younger, you know, than when the symptoms actually appear. And there's a move to diagnose Alzheimer's earlier and earlier. The difficulty with that is that there's nothing in terms of curing, you know, Alzheimer's. There's not a pill you should be taking.
Right.
Where that leads you to, however, is, well, you should be identifying the risk factors and modifying them, and you should be identifying the protective factors and modifying them. When should you do that? Well, everybody should be doing it, not just those who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Everybody ought to be doing that as soon as possible.
Okay.
So those are the modifiable risk factors. The two those are the modifiable risk factors. They also talk about non-modifiable risk factors, and generally it's age and your genetic
So
makeup.
you can't change the day you were born. It's that day, that month, that year. And that's what we call a chronological age on the calendar. That's not the same as your brain age, or what we call brain age, body age. Okay, that's one is chronological.
And then the other is your genetic makeup.
Genetic, okay, and we get a lot of questions. The questions are often, is there anything that I can do? And I've gotten that. I remember a lady at Intel that I was talking there, and afterwards some questions, and she came up to me, Michael, with obviously 2 daughters behind her, and they were the last ones there. And you and I are very careful that we are not doctors. We never, ever question a doctor, but we do say, ask your doctor some questions. So she gently asked me whether or not that I didn't say anything about genetics or heredity. And so I said, are we talking about somebody who is related to someone who is diagnosed with Alzheimer's? And the two heads of the 2 daughters just went like this behind her. And so what I did was to say to her, be honest about this with me. Are you talking about you? And she said, yes. My parents and my brother all died of Alzheimer's. Now, you and I know that that phrase is common, died of Alzheimer's. Too often we found that that phrase is really not supported by facts necessarily, because it could have been something else, especially in earlier eras when we didn't know as much as we know now. But what she did was to listen when I said to her, because you have all those genetic markers, and I did this very carefully, there's nothing that can be done about it. And then I kept looking at her and smiling at her. And when she started to smile, I said, now do you want to know the rest of the story? Okay. And she said, I sure do. And I said, your risk factor, ma'am, will stay a little bit higher. If you do nothing, it'll stay that high. But if you do something, you're going to be able to lower that maybe down to the same as someone who didn't have that non-modifiable. So it really is something that genetics could be modified if somebody understands that they have to do more than maybe I do. And it's not fair, but it's something that we now know she should be aware that she is at a higher risk, so do more than the next neighbor does.
Yeah, so that's why I think that what we call non-modifiable risk factors are in fact still modifiable.
Yeah.
Taking that instance of the gene, you're talking about probably about the ApoE4 allele, which if you have it, it means that you're at 25% greater risk of getting dementia and Alzheimer's. It doesn't mean you're gonna get Alzheimer's. It's just there's a greater likelihood, and as Roger is saying, depending upon what you do with your life. And there's a new field, if you haven't heard this word, make note because it's an important new field, epigenetics. And it means more than genetics. And it's this, maybe just in the last 10 years, I'd say, or even 5, people have begun to scientists have identified that there are chemical substances that wrap themselves around the genes. And actually, they're like a cloak over the gene. Genes are inert. They don't have any influence over anything unless they express themselves, unless they do out. They can't do it on their own. They only do it in response to the environment of the cell that they're in.
Something triggers it.
Something triggers it.
Right.
And these methyl cloaks that get on the gene seem to influence whether the gene will be expressed or not expressed. And it's environmental influences that put those cloaks on or off. So what we do, what we experience, actually modifies the expression of the gene. So you really can change the way your genes behave by what you do.
And we know that this is brand new. It's an evolving field, but so far it looks better and better with each wave of studies. That lady that I talked to, she would be able, even if she did have all of the biomarkers that we mentioned, if she was doing all she could to continue to protect herself, then that could take away that once non-modifiable and move it to the modifiable category.
Yeah, it's not a guarantee, but you might as well do all you can.
But what is a guarantee is if she does nothing, then that stays up at that higher mountain. Using that as an analogy, then have her work every day to push that down back to where she is no longer at a higher risk than everyone else.
Or even to take it further, if she does nothing and allows damage
Yes.
to happen to her brain, the risk becomes greater.
Good
that
point.
She will do it.
Good point.
Last point, going back
Okay.
to the aging and your differentiation between chronic age. I mean, the idea that age is a risk factor for dementia essentially is saying that on average, when you look at everybody who's age 80, the risk of getting Alzheimer's is this. When it's 85, it's more.
So again, that's on average.
Right.
And one of the real important factors is that if you are doing something that's average or worse than average, then you should really focus on it. But if you're doing something and doing lots of somethings to really protect your brain against and to nurture your brain for brain health, then you're moving into that category that is much different from that average that you hear.
Yeah, so I think what is really being talked about is your physical age, your health age. And the worse your health age gets, the greater your risk is of getting dementia. But that's modifiable. I mean, your health to a certain extent is modifiable. You can't always prevent these strange diseases that come at you, but you can stay healthier or non-healthier, and by doing that, you kind of increase your healthy age, and you push the Alzheimer's out further. So, modifiable risk factors, very key to what we talk about in terms of brain health.
It really is, and it extends an entire lifetime. I'm going to finish with this, and that's we used to try to monitor the myths that have been shattered in aging, and the list got so big we really don't monitor it because there have been so many myths. And we do a compilation, we may do that in another segment, but one of the myths that fits in here, and we still hear it, and it's not true. If you live long enough, Michael, you will get Alzheimer's. And because that still is out there, we want to make sure that people know that you're in control. You can't sit back and do nothing. You have to both play defense and protect yourself against these risk factors, and then focus on the word modifiable. That's not defense, that's going on the offense and doing what you can to change your entire risk factor.
Great.
Thank you.